They thought winter would bury me. Turns out, it just gave me the material to bury them instead. The first thing I heard that morning wasn't my alarm clock. It was the low diesel growl of a snowplow idling just outside my bedroom window, steady and patient like it owned the place. And when I stepped out onto my back porch, the cold air hit my lungs so sharp it felt like broken glass. The kind of dry, bitter cold that settles into your bones and doesn't leave. And there it was again. Another mountain of snow shoved right over my property line, piling higher against my fence like it had been happening forever, like it was normal, like I didn't exist. The scrape of metal against asphalt echoing down the cul-de-sac as the plow backed up and pushed one more load onto my land without so much as a glance. Just business as usual for Willow Ridge HOA. My name's Ethan Caldwell, and 3 months before that morning, I thought I'd finally found a place where things could be simple again. A modest half-acre lot at the very end of a quiet suburban street just outside Denver. Nothing fancy, just enough space to breathe, enough distance from neighbors to not hear every argument through the walls. After the divorce, I needed quiet more than anything, and this place had it. Or at least it did until winter rolled in and the HOA decided my property wasn't really mine anymore. See, when the first snowstorm hit back in November, I didn't think much of it. Watched the plows clear the street, figured everyone was just doing their job. But then I noticed where all that snow was going. Not evenly spread, not hauled away. No, it was all getting pushed into one spot, my spot, right where my land dipped slightly below the road. Like gravity itself had signed some agreement I never saw. And at first I let it slide, figured maybe it was temporary, maybe they'd fix it, maybe someone would knock on my door and explain, but no one did. Instead, every storm after that brought the same routine, the same sound, the same growing wall of packed, dirty snow creeping further into my yard, crushing the grass, bending the fence posts, blocking the side of my driveway until I had to shovel a path just to get my truck out. And every time I cleared it, they filled it right back up again like I was invisible, like my land was just overflow storage for their perfect little neighborhood. And then came Brenda Whitmore, HOA president, stepping out of her white SUV one afternoon in a coat that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage, smiling like she was doing me a favor, telling me in that syrupy voice that the snow placement was temporary and necessary for community safety, like I should be grateful they chose my property instead of someone else's, like I didn't have a say in what happened on land I paid for. And that was the moment something shifted, not anger, not yet, just clarity. Because as I stood there watching another load of snow slide off that plow and settle onto my yard with a heavy, suffocating thud, I realized this wasn't about snow at all. This was about boundaries, about who gets to decide what belongs to who. And what Brenda didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I wasn't just some guy with a shovel and a problem. I understood structure, weight, and flow. I knew how things moved when enough pressure built up. And by the time winter was over, every single pound of snow they dumped on my land was going to end up exactly where it needed to be, just not where they expected. I learned pretty quickly that in this neighborhood, silence meant permission, and the longer I said nothing, the more comfortable they got treating my land like it was part of their system, not mine. So I started paying attention, not reacting, just watching, because there is a difference between a problem and a pattern, and what they were doing was a pattern. Every snowfall over 3 inches triggered the same routine. The same county-contracted plow would come down Willow Ridge Drive, clear the street clean down to black asphalt, then swing wide at the end of the cul-de-sac and angle everything toward the lowest point, my lot, like water finding its level. Except this was not natural, it was deliberate, controlled, repeated. I could hear it before I saw it every time. That hydraulic whine, the scrape, the heavy push, followed by the soft collapse of packed snow hitting my yard in layers, wet, dense, and dirty with road salt. And by mid-December those layers were not just piles anymore. They were forming ridges, 5 feet high in some spots, stretching nearly 40 feet along my property line, and the weight of it started to show. My fence posts leaned like tired soldiers, the wooden panels creaking under pressure, and the edge of my driveway disappeared completely, forcing me to carve a narrow path with a shovel every morning just to get to work. My gloves would soak through within minutes, fingers going numb, while the cold air burned in my chest, and every time I cleared it, I knew it was temporary, because by the next storm it would all be back, heavier, higher, closer. I started measuring without telling anyone, pacing it out in boots, counting steps, estimating volume like I was back on a job site, calculating how much weight was sitting on my land, thousands of pounds stacking up week after week. And what bothered me was not just the damage, it was the assumption, no request, no agreement, just an unspoken decision that my property was expendable, that I would deal with it, that I had no choice. Then the letters started showing up, neat white envelopes with the HOA logo stamped in the corner. Inside were polite little notices about maintaining property appearance during winter months, suggestions about keeping my yard clear of excessive snow buildup, like they were not the ones putting it there, like I was somehow responsible for the mess they created. I remember standing in my kitchen holding one of those letters, the smell of cheap printer ink still fresh on the paper, reading the words twice just to make sure I was not missing something. And that was when I stopped seeing this as inconvenience and started seeing it as leverage. Because if they were documenting it, that meant they believed in it. And if they believed in it, they would keep doing it. And if they kept doing it, they would keep adding to the same place. My place. And that meant one thing, accumulation. Controlled, predictable accumulation. And that is when the idea started forming, not all at once, just a small shift in how I looked at those piles. I stopped seeing them as something to remove and started seeing them as something to shape, something to guide, something that could be redirected with the right structure in the right place. I walked the edge of my property that evening as the sun dropped behind the houses, the snow crunching under my boots, the air turning even sharper as the temperature fell below 20 degrees, and I studied the slope, the angle of the street, the way the plow naturally pushed everything toward me, and I realized something simple but powerful. They were already doing most of the work for me. They were delivering material, compacting it, stacking it higher. Every week, all I had to do was decide where it would end up, and for the first time since winter started, I smiled, not because the problem was gone, but because I finally understood it. I did not build anything right away. That was the first rule I gave myself, because reacting too early would only make them cautious, and I needed them comfortable, predictable. So instead I kept playing the same role they had already assigned to me. The quiet guy at the end of the street who just dealt with things. I shoveled when I had to, kept my driveway barely usable, waved at neighbors when they passed by like nothing was wrong. And all the while I kept watching, timing, learning the rhythm of their system, every plow run, every snowfall, every angle of that blade when it curved at the cul-de-sac. By early January, I could tell you exactly how much snow would land on my property based on the forecast alone. 6 inches of snowfall meant about 8 cubic yards pushed into my yard. A foot of snow meant closer to 15. Heavy wet storms packed tighter, dry powder stacked higher but lighter. It all mattered. And the more I understood it, the more I realized this was not chaos. It was consistency. And consistency is something you can work with. I started marking small points along my property line. Nothing obvious, just subtle stakes low to the ground, enough for me to track how far the piles were creeping toward the street, how the edges shifted after each plow pass. And what I saw confirmed what I had been thinking. Everything naturally wanted to move toward the same direction, not just onto my land, but along it, following the slight slope that ran parallel to the road, like a slow-moving river made of packed ice. And that was when the plan sharpened, not just redirecting the snow, but guiding it, shaping it over time instead of all at once. I spent a Saturday morning in my garage with the door cracked open, the cold air slipping in while I measured out lumber and sketched rough angles on the back of an old invoice. Nothing complicated, just basic structure, low barriers, positioned at just the right angle to catch what was already coming and nudge it a few degrees off its usual path. Not enough to be obvious, just enough to change the final destination. I loaded the materials into my truck that afternoon, drove to the hardware store like it was any other weekend project, picked up pressure-treated boards, metal stakes, and a box of screws, the kind of things nobody looks twice at. And by the time the next storm rolled in, I was ready. The air that night had that heavy stillness that always comes before snowfall, quiet, almost waiting. And when the first flakes started falling, slow and steady under the streetlights, I stood at my window watching. Not frustrated this time, not annoyed, just focused, because for the first time since winter started, I was not on the receiving end of their system anymore. I was part of it, shaping it, letting them keep doing exactly what they had been doing for months. Only now, every load they pushed, every pile they stacked, Every pound of snow they dumped was no longer just sitting on my land. It was being guided, redirected inch by inch, storm by storm, into something they would not even notice until it was far too late to do anything about it. The first barrier went in on a Tuesday afternoon when the sky was clear and the neighborhood felt calm. The kind of day where nobody expects anything to change. I kept it low, barely 2 feet high, angled just enough to catch the edge of whatever the plow pushed toward my yard. Nothing dramatic, just wood and stakes driven deep into frozen ground with slow, steady pressure until they held firm. The metal rang softly with each strike, dull and controlled, and when I stepped back, it did not look like much, just a small reinforcement along the property line, something any homeowner might do to protect their yard from winter damage, and that was exactly the point. It had to look ordinary, because the moment it looked intentional, the moment it looked like resistance, they would question it, and I needed them not to question anything. The next snowfall came 2 days later, light at first, then steady through the night, and just before dawn I heard the plow again. That same familiar engine, that same mechanical rhythm carving through the silence. I stood by the window, coffee in hand, watching as the truck made its pass, blade angled, pushing everything toward my lot like it always did. Except this time, when the snow hit the edge of my property, it met the barrier, and instead of spreading out, it slowed, compacted, and began to stack slightly higher along that angled line. Just a subtle shift, nothing dramatic, but enough for me to notice, enough for me to confirm it was working. Over the next week, I added 2 more sections, extending the line gradually, each piece placed with the same careful attention, always low, always angled, always blending into the landscape so it never drew attention. And with each storm, the effect became more pronounced. The snow no longer spread evenly across my yard. It started to form a guided ridge, a narrow, rising path that followed the direction I had set, inch by inch, storm by storm. And the best part was they kept helping me. Every time the plow came through, it packed the snow tighter, denser, turning loose piles into solid mass, reinforcing the structure without even realizing it. I did not have to lift a shovel anymore. I just watched as they delivered and compacted the material for me. And the ridge grew, 3 feet, then 4, then pushing closer to 5 in some sections, its surface hardening in the cold, the top smoothing out under fresh layers while the base locked in place like concrete. And still, nobody said a word, not Brenda, not the neighbors, not the HOA. To them it was just winter, just snow doing what snow does, piling up where it always had, except now it was no longer random. It was directional, controlled. I started noticing small changes in how the plow moved too, slight adjustments in its path to avoid the denser buildup near my line, which only made it push more snow along the angle I had created, feeding the ridge further down its length, guiding it slowly toward the edge of the street entrance. And one evening as I walked the perimeter, boots crunching over the hardened surface, I ran my glove along the side of that growing wall and felt how solid it had become, cold, dense, unyielding. And I realized something that made me stop and look back toward the quiet row of houses behind me. They still thought they were getting rid of a problem, clearing their street, keeping everything neat and accessible. But what they were really doing, load by load, was building something far bigger than a pile of snow, something that was starting to take shape just out of their sight, something that, given enough time and one good storm, would not just sit on my land anymore. It would reach out and change theirs. By mid-January, the ridge was no longer something you could ignore if you stood in the right spot. But that was the thing about perspective. From the street, it still looked like winter buildup, just another uneven line of snow pushed to the side. Nothing unusual in a Colorado neighborhood after weeks of storms. But from inside my property, walking along its length, it felt different, taller than it should have been, denser than anything I had seen form naturally, the surface hard as packed ice, where the plow had compressed it layer after layer, and underneath all of that weight was structure, my structure, guiding it inch by inch exactly where I wanted it to go. I kept my movements small and intentional, adding another angled section here, reinforcing a weak point there, always working during quiet hours when nobody was paying attention, gloves stiff with cold, breath fogging in the air as I tightened screws into wood that felt like stone from the freezing temperatures. Each piece looked insignificant on its own, but together they created a subtle curve, a long arc that slowly bent toward the street entrance. not blocking anything yet, not even close, just shaping the path. And every time the plow came through, it followed the same habit, pushing more snow straight into that system, packing it tighter, raising it higher, helping me build something they could not see forming. And the more it grew, the more I noticed small reactions from the neighborhood, nothing direct. Just looks, pauses, the way people slowed their cars slightly when passing the end of the cul-de-sac, like something fell off even if they could not explain it. One afternoon I caught Brenda standing near the curb, arms folded, sunglasses on despite the gray sky, staring at the accumulation along my property line, her heels pressed carefully into the cleared asphalt as she tilted her head just slightly, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. And when she noticed me watching from my driveway, she gave that same tight smile, the kind that pretends everything is under control, and said something about how heavy this winter had been, how snow management was getting more difficult for everyone. Like she was testing the words, seeing if I would agree. I just nodded, kept my voice calm, told her it had definitely been piling up, because that was the truth, just not the whole truth. She lingered for a moment longer, eyes drifting back to the ridge, then turned and walked away. And that was when I knew she had noticed something, not enough to act, but enough to feel it. And that was exactly where I wanted her, aware but uncertain, because uncertainty makes people hesitate, and hesitation buys time. And time was the one thing I needed most. The forecast that week called for a major storm. 12 to 16 inches expected over 2 days, heavy, wet snow with temperatures hovering just below freezing. The kind that compacts fast and locks together like concrete when it settles. I checked it twice, then walked the full length of the ridge that evening, boots sinking slightly into the outer layer while the core stayed solid beneath me. I could feel the weight of it through the soles, thousands of pounds already in place, all of it positioned along that gradual curve leading toward the street. And for the first time since this started, I could see the final shape clearly in my head, not just a pile, not just a ridge, but a wall in progress, built slowly, quietly, using nothing but what they had given me. And as the first flakes of that storm began to fall, thick and steady against the dim glow of the streetlights, I stood there in the cold and realized they were about to finish what they started without even knowing it. The storm did not arrive all at once. It built slowly through the night, wind picking up first, rattling against the siding, then the steady hiss of snow sweeping across the street like sandpaper against asphalt. And by the time I stepped outside before sunrise, the world felt muted, heavy, the kind of silence that only comes when everything is buried under a fresh layer, the air thick with cold moisture that clung to your face and made every breath visible. I could already see the difference. The ridge along my property had doubled in height overnight, the fresh snow settling into the shape I had been guiding for weeks, smoothing the surface, adding weight, locking everything together. And when I heard the plow coming down the street, slower this time, engine working harder against the deeper accumulation, I did not move. I just stood there near the edge of my driveway and watched. The blade hit the snow with a dull, heavy push, carving a path through nearly a foot of wet buildup. And just like every time before it, angled toward my property, pushing everything forward. Only now the volume was different, heavier, thicker, and when that load met the ridge, it did not spread out. It stacked, compressed, and began to climb. The top line rising higher, sharper, following the curve I had set weeks ago. The plow backed up, came in again, pushing another wave, then another, each pass reinforcing the structure, building it upward and outward along that same controlled path. And I could see it happening in real time, the final stage of something that had been forming piece by piece, the ridge extending further toward the street entrance, narrowing the open space without anyone realizing it yet. Because from their perspective, they were just clearing the road, just doing their job. And that was the part that made it work. They never questioned the direction. They never stopped to consider where all that snow was actually going once it left the blade. They just kept pushing, and I let them. By midday, the snowfall intensified, thick, heavy flakes falling fast enough to blur the houses across the street. The temperature hovering just below freezing. Perfect conditions for packing, every layer bonding to the one beneath it, turning loose snow into solid mass within hours. And the ridge transformed into something else entirely, no longer uneven, no longer scattered. It was continuous now. a rising wall that followed the arc of my property and reached toward the edge of the road like a slow, inevitable movement. I spent the afternoon making small adjustments, reinforcing the lowest points, tightening the angles, making sure nothing broke under the added weight. My gloves soaked through, fingers stiff and aching as I worked, but I kept moving, methodical, controlled, because this was the moment everything depended on, not force, not speed, just precision. And as evening fell and the storm kept going, I stepped back onto my porch and looked out across what used to be an open edge between my land and their street. And I could see it clearly now. The path was nearly gone. The opening narrowed to a fraction of what it had been. And one more heavy push, one more round of plowing in the morning, and that space would disappear completely, not because I blocked it, but because they finished what they had started. And as the wind carried the sound of distant engines still working through the neighborhood, I realized something simple. They were still out there clearing their road, making it clean, making it accessible, completely unaware that every pass was sealing it off instead. Morning came with that dull gray light that makes everything look colder than it already is, and the storm had not fully let up, just slowed enough to reveal what had been building overnight. I stepped outside and the air hit me thick and wet, the kind that sticks to your jacket and seeps through seams. And for a second I just stood there, taking it in, because the shape I had been working toward for weeks was no longer subtle. It was obvious. The ridge had become a continuous wall, rising nearly 6 feet in some sections, dense and solid from repeated compaction. Its surface smooth in places where fresh snow had settled, jagged in others where the plow had pressed it hard, and most importantly, it had reached the edge of the street, narrowing the exit down to a single, shallow gap that barely looked like a passage anymore. And I knew what was about to happen before I even heard the engine. That low mechanical rumble pushing through the morning silence, the plow making its final pass, doing exactly what it had been trained to do, clearing the road, pushing everything forward. And as it came down the cul-de-sac, blade angled like always, it gathered the last heavy layer of snow and drove it straight toward the only opening left. I watched from the side of my driveway, hands in my pockets, breath steady. As that final push met the narrowed gap, the snow surged forward, compressed against the existing wall, and for a brief moment it looked like it might spill through, like it might just spread out enough to leave a path. But then the weight caught, the angle held, and everything locked into place, sealing it, not with a crash or a dramatic shift, but with a quiet, final compression, like a door closing without a sound. The plow backed up, hesitated for just a second, then tried again, pushing against it from a slightly different angle, but it did not break, it did not give. All that packed snow, layered over weeks, reinforced by every pass they had made, held exactly where it was. And that was when the driver realized something was wrong. I could see it in the way the truck idled longer than usual, the blade lifting slightly, then dropping again as if trying to figure out what it was pushing against. And by the time the engine cut back and the truck reversed out of the cul-de-sac, the entrance was gone, not blocked by anything I had placed there, not obstructed by a fence or a barrier, but closed off by the very snow they had pushed day after day, storm after storm. And within minutes the neighborhood started to wake up to it. Garage doors opening, engines starting, then stopping, tires rolling forward only to pause at the end of the street where the wall stood, tall and solid, stretching across the exit like it had always been there, muffling sound, reflecting that gray morning light back toward the houses. I stayed where I was, watching it unfold, the slow realization spreading from one house to the next, people stepping out onto their driveways, looking down the street, trying to make sense of why the road they depended on every day was suddenly not there anymore. And as I looked at that wall, at the clean, continuous line it formed right at the edge of my property, I felt that same calm clarity settle in again, because I had not blocked anything. I had not taken anything from them. I had simply let everything they pushed onto my land find its way back to the only place it could go once it had nowhere else left to spread. It did not take long for the calm to break. At first it was just confusion, engines idling longer than usual, car doors opening and closing again, voices carrying across the cold air in short, sharp bursts, the kind people use when something does not make sense yet. But that confusion turned into urgency fast. Within 15 minutes there were 3 vehicles lined up at the end of the cul-de-sac, each one inching forward, stopping just short of the wall, tires pressing into the packed snow and slipping slightly before backing off. The sound of spinning rubber muffled under the thick layer. And then came the footsteps, boots crunching hard against the frozen surface as neighbors walked down to see it up close. Hands on hips, heads tilting, trying to understand how a clear street had turned into a dead end overnight. I stayed back near my garage, not hiding, just observing, because this was the part where they had to see it for themselves. Brenda was not far behind, her white SUV, pulling up slower than usual, stopping well before the others, and when she stepped out, she did not smile this time. Her expression tight, focused, the cold air catching in her breath as she walked forward in careful steps, heels clicking against patches of exposed asphalt before crunching into the packed snow. She ran her hand along the surface of the wall like she was testing it, pressing lightly at first, then harder, as if expecting it to give, but it did not move, not even a little, and that was when her eyes shifted, not at the wall, but along its length, following the curve back toward my property, tracing the line that connected everything. And when her gaze finally landed on me, there was no confusion left in it, just realization, sharp and immediate. She started walking in my direction, faster now, the sound of her steps cutting through the low murmur of the neighbors behind her, and when she reached my driveway, she stopped just short of the property line, like there was something invisible there she could not cross. Her voice came out controlled, but tight, asking me if I knew anything about what had happened to the street, and I could still hear the distant hum of engines behind her, people waiting, expecting an answer. I kept my tone even, told her the snow had been piling up for weeks, that every storm added more to the same place, and that with the amount we got last night, it must have finally reached a point where it had nowhere else to go. She shook her head slightly, eyes narrowing, pointing back toward the wall, saying this was not normal, that something had changed, and she was right. Something had changed, just not in the way she wanted to admit. I reminded her that the snow had always been pushed onto my property, that it had been building there all winter, and that I had simply left it where it landed, letting gravity and the slope do what they naturally do, move things toward the lowest available path, which in this case happened to be right back toward the street entrance. She opened her mouth like she was about to argue, then stopped, glancing over her shoulder at the line of cars, at the neighbors watching, waiting, and in that moment I could see the shift, not in control, but in certainty, because she could not deny what everyone else was already seeing, that the wall was made of the same snow they had been dumping for months, and that it was sitting exactly where that snow had always been directed. And as the cold wind carried the quiet frustration of the blocked street back toward us, I realized this was no longer just my problem to deal with. It had finally become theirs. By noon the street no longer sounded like a quiet neighborhood. It sounded like a problem trying to solve itself. Engines revving and cutting off, doors slamming harder than usual, voices rising just enough to carry across the cold air, and somewhere in the middle of it all was Brenda, pacing near the edge of the wall with her phone pressed tight against her ear, her voice controlled but urgent as she explained the situation to someone on the other end. Probably the city, probably trying to frame it as an unexpected obstruction, something sudden, something outside of anyone's control, but the truth was standing right there in front of all of us. 6 feet tall and stretching across the only exit, built one load at a time over weeks of decisions nobody questioned. It took another hour before the county truck showed up, a different one this time, heavier, with a wider blade and flashing amber lights cutting through the gray afternoon. It rolled to a stop at the entrance and idled for a moment, the driver stepping out slowly, boots sinking slightly into the packed surface as he walked up to inspect the wall. He ran a gloved hand along it, just like Brenda had, testing the density, looking at the height, then turning to follow its length back toward my property, and I could see it in his posture. The same realization, not confusion, not surprise, just a quiet understanding of how it got there. He walked over to me after that, not confrontational, just direct, asking if this was all coming off my land. And I told him the same thing I had told Brenda, that everything pushed onto my property had stayed on my property, that I had not moved it onto the street, had not transported it, had not obstructed anything. I had simply left it where it accumulated and allowed it to settle along the natural slope. He nodded once, slow, like he had already reached that conclusion himself, and then he turned back toward the wall, and let out a breath that fogged in the cold air, because now it was not just a neighborhood inconvenience. It was a logistical problem. Removing something that dense, that large, would take time, equipment, and money, and none of it would be quick. Brenda stepped in again at that point, her voice sharper now, asking how long it would take to clear, pressing for urgency, for priority, and the driver looked at her, then at the wall, then back at her, and said something simple that seemed to hang in the air longer than anything else that morning. That this kind of buildup does not happen overnight, that it comes from repeated pushing in the same direction over time, and that if it had been managed differently from the start, it would not be sitting there now. There was no accusation in his tone, just fact, but it landed harder than anything else, because everyone standing there knew exactly what he meant. The next few hours were slow, methodical, the truck repositioning, starting to cut into the edge of the wall piece by piece, the blade chipping away at layers that had been compacted over weeks, each section breaking loose with a dull, heavy sound before being pushed aside, and as the opening gradually reappeared, narrow at first, then widening enough for a single vehicle to pass, the street began to move again. One car at a time, easing through the space that had been closed off that morning, but the mood had changed. There was no relief in it, no casual conversation, just quiet acknowledgement of what had happened and why. Brenda did not say another word to me. Not that day, not after the truck left and the street was finally clear enough to function again. And over the next week, the plow patterns changed, the angle shifted, the snow was no longer pushed toward my property. Instead, it was distributed along the sides of the road like it should have been from the beginning, balanced, managed, controlled, and as I stood on my porch one evening watching a fresh pass leave the street clean without touching my land, I realized something simple. I never had to fight them, never had to argue, never had to stop what they were doing. I just let it continue until it became their problem to fix, because in the end, they did not get blocked by me, they got blocked by the result of their own decisions. And that is the kind of lesson people do not forget once they see it for themselves.